started with what this will look like. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna just click this. That's fine. So if you didn't know the words of the resolution, it's probably a good starting point, right? To know what the topic is for the 2020-2021 school year, and that is that for high school, of course. And that is that the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, and sentencing. And while this is catered towards the high school topic, there is not a particular or specific wording for the college resolution quite as yet, but everything that we are saying is strategy, and so it will still apply, and we will kind of add that in as we discuss this lecture for our college students. And so, yeah, for those watching as well. So in terms of the CJR topic that I am thinking from the affirmative perspective. I forgot to put AF in the bookmark header, but it is a conundrum for both sides. A very AF heavy topic in terms of ground, but that there is space and room for the negative, but there's a lot of kind of moral implications to this topic that are rightfully so going to add some kind of texture to this topic, but something that we have to address. So we plan to use the conundrum of the resolution as a justification for the critical affirmative. So there should be a moral pause when thinking about reform, and I put CRJ, CJR, it's fine. Most of the time, these reforms require accepting the limitations of justice for Black and brown folks, which means that abiding by a normative action concedes the premise of criminality as something that has to be accepted for an arbitrary metric of better than the quo, which means that the resolution is not a substantial reform for people, but rather a substantial reform for the system to continue itself. Now, I want to draw upon an earlier, not lecture, but when we were part of the discussion panel with the Still She Rises ED, as well as their client advocates. And there was a discussion about how justice is a concept, more so than it has any kind of what necessitates a good or a successful or kind of written to failure plan, but not that it is embedded or kind of the, I don't know, my connection. Hopefully, can y'all also still hear me? I just got a notification about my internet connection. Can y'all still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. You cut out for a second, but you're good now.
Okay, perfect. But yeah, that justice is a concept, not necessarily the starting point of a policy. And so what are the ways in which it is strived for? Is it something that should be strived for? All of those kind of questions get complicated with, the critical affirmative, hopefully, and also are ways that the critical affirmative can set itself up in terms of thinking about its relationship to the resolution. Caitlin, I didn't know if you wanted to add something here, kind of from a negative perspective, just on the kind of the biases of the resolution in terms of ground or anything like that before we get into kind of the top part.
Yeah, I think just one thing I'd add here is when thinking from the negative perspective, I think a lot of people auto assume that framework kind of has to be the worst version or the most narrow version of what the legal understanding of a hypothetical enactment, or it has to be a defense of that worst version or most narrow version of hypothetical enactment, right? I think there are grounds to argue that things like a substantial reform could be, get rid of policing or whatever. And that's a tea debate to be had. But I think that when you're thinking it through framework, you should not start with I guess, that question, because like that's just a debate to be had in the round, depending on what counterinterpretation an affirmative might read. Rather, framework is only concerned with ground insofar as explaining a very narrow set of impacts. Rather, it's, you know, inherently a debate about what debate should be for everyone, right? And when I say that, I think people confuse it with like it's a debate about all aspects of the activity, which is not what, you know, a debate about debate means. Rather, I believe it's a debate about certain aspects of the activity. So it's a debate about what the process of a round should look like and what determines the parameters for better debating. And kind of regardless of the maybe moral justifications driving those like kind of barriers for any given topic, like I think literature drives them more. And I think the implication of that being tied up in the larger, like, kind of, you know, structural powers that determine, you know, academia access to literature, kind of what is put in, like, you know, our Google feeds or whatever, is the core of, like, you know, the education, like whether this is like the most effective system to like learn about the world, but like I don't think is a reason like why framework itself or like the resolution and the constraints that exist are bad. Like the process to come to determine those things. Like I think that's more like of a broader question that I think negative teams should problematize more rather than just like kind of accepting as a premise.
Okay. Jacob, did you want to add anything there? Or are you good? Just want to make
Probably
sure.
good on this section. My one disagreement would be I think there are contexts by which how topics are chosen. So the claim that, you know, literature decides the basis of our research seems to, you know, take for granted the assumed inevitability or universality of how topics are chosen, the wordings that are written, the institutional factors of people who are on play, who don't have, you know, representation, who has representation, and even if there is representation, how much power does that representation have? And even when the compromise happens, at what point, who ends up having to compromise more than other people? This is my only one statement.
I just want to add one clarification. I agree there's a lot of inertia in those things, and like a lot of those things do structure how the resolution is ultimately like, or like a topic is ultimately decided or like debated upon. I just don't necessarily think that that's the burden of a negative debater to have to justify or whatever, because they are not necessarily responsible for, like, you know, like if you give like the college example, it's a lot easier to name the institutions than the high school example, where it's like, you know, NSDA, a bunch, or and like a bunch of like random like coaches that aren't even necessarily associated with debate kind of being used to like decide the topic. Like there's just a separate process, but like for college, like the CETA, NDT people who are elected, whatever, like there's only votes on 2 of those members that are open to like everyone in the community, not, you know, the rest of the people are kind of just there by inertia. And I don't think, you know, negative debaters have to be responsible for that, because they're not necessarily, they don't have their hands on those levers of power either.
They're to somewhat, you know, defending rules and, you know, norms created by those institutions. So I think at some point, you know, they can be like, don't blame the student for, you know, the curriculum of the teacher. But at some point, the move to read framework means, you know, they're fine with the creation of those, you know, resolutions.
I don't think process and content are the same thing. And I think framework is inherently a debate about process, and the content you choose to defend is on you.
Yeah. I would say process over time does influence content, or the desire to change content, right? So if there's, you know, not a, you know, substantial influence on their competitive mindset by relying upon a distinction between process and content, I think then it forestalls any desire on that side of the aisle to change the content because
I think the competitive nature of the activity undermines, and this is maybe getting too far into the discussion already before we get further into the slides, but like just like the competitive nature of itself kind of undermines the like, you know, typical understanding of how like repetition ingrains ideas into people, because the way, at least how I understand a lot of policy debaters are initially trained, and like a lot of people who are trained in the policy mindset, which is like, you know, a lot of critique debaters as well beforehand, just because like given again the inertia of like how the system works, is like you are presenting arguments for competition's sake, not necessarily for like their moral educational value. Those things kind of happen afterwards in the conversations you have, not necessarily in round. So I don't think that the repetition of the process in round, if it is structured by competition, necessarily ingrains ideas in the same way that like the conversations you're having outside of rounds do, which I don't think is what Framework is defending.
I don't think in that context the statement is that, you know, it's the competition ingrains in people's like, you know, wholesale ideas of themselves and their debate. But if at a point you can create a distinction between process and content to win debates, then there becomes not as much of a necessary competitive incentive to change the content.
All right. Well, with that, because I think a lot of this is going to happen in other places too. We can move to the next slide because I do also have thoughts, but I'm also taking notes on what you all are saying because, you know, as what everyone who's watching this should be doing is thinking about this in the context of, you know, their own arguments in debate. And from a coach, I'm listening on to two people who have, you know, very distinct thoughts that are helpful. I'm taking notes for how I'm thinking about things. So you should be doing the same because it is helpful. This is a resource. Use it. So from the affirmative, we're going to start at the interpretation. And then Caitlin will fill in thoughts. Jacob could fill in thoughts too on the negative side or affirmative side. This is all just kind of like, hey, we're here. Hello, how's it going? But interpretation. First is what the kind of definition of an interpretation is to get to then what the role of counter interpretations, counter models, and all these things kind of begin to make sense for me. And that is that it is an explanation or way of meaning something, a teaching technique that combines factual with stimulating explanatory information. Or, you know, or something to kind of calcify that down even further is that they're not singular, but that interpretations have a very kind of functional purpose, right? That they are utilized for singular purposes in the context of debate, i.e. that we read an interpretation because it allows for either the affirmative or the negative to have access to the rest of the arguments that they are making and to show a violation or to one, create competition between the affirmative and negative, and B, to show how the affirmative or negative has violated the kind of the interpretation that you have set up, right? It's intentional why you set the interpretation up because it will compete with the other side, and then, you know, all the additional stuff, i.e. all the standards and this conversational ground and fairness, education, and all that kind of stuff, you know, happens after. But I thought it was important to kind of bring up that interpretations are not objective or absent of any kind of subjective purpose or utilization, but rather are kind of the part of debate that kind of brings the focus to either the affirmative or negative side to create that competition. It might not always be like the holistic thing, right? Like, yeah, we just thought that we should bring up this interpretation in terms of the affirmative defense and hypothetical enactment of a policy plan. And like that is like the way in which we should understand things. That is a kind of subjective and kind of moral argument that is biased rather than like something that, you know, the world just decided, and that's how we should interpret or understand how debate, or how, not even debate, because that's not really a debate argument, but just how the resolution should be understood, or, you know, if we're using it very kind of colloquially, interpreted. So examples of this would be debates should be centered around hypothetical enactment. I said that. our government policy key to fixed net benefits such as policy education or affect change to policy. Interps in this sense focus on the debate on particular goals that are best achieved through this interpretation. Negative thoughts on that same thing. Caitlin, Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the negatives goal is about like juggling basically two different interpretations at any given point throughout the entirety of the debate, because you have your like framework interpretation that kind of sets up the like kind of what Jasmine was setting up, the not subjective, this is what an AF team does kind of thing, which is, hypothetical enactment through the United States federal government, the need to have the agent of the federal government and federal means to, use fiat to hypothetically enact those things. And then the other one, in which, I think defines what debate as an activity should do. And I'm going to discuss kind of how I think negative debaters should, deal with that subjective nature in a second. But the second thing I think people are juggling is then after that, what constitutes topical action. So after the USFG should part, what mechanistically is being described for that agent to put into action. So then I believe it's on the next slide. I don't know if it is or if it's a later slide, but I have two old college resolutions where I kind of work through what I mean by the mechanistic description words in a resolution versus the agent words. But if you think about the example of the CJR topic that was in the earlier slides, the mechanistic thing would be whatever a substantial reform of the criminal justice systems in, whatever area you choose is. So if it's we should substantially reform sentencing by abolishing mandatory minimums or whatever, there is a topicality debate to be had about whether or not that is what is meant by a substantial criminal justice reform in the area of sentencing, right? It seems obvious that thing is topical or whatever example I chose, but for that example I chose. But there are cards that potentially could define that as not being topical or whatever. So it's juggling what you think is the best interpretation to, encompass the literature that the affirmative thinks is important, but also kind of attaching it to the subjective interpretation of the USFG as a federal means should do that. So whatever that ends up being mechanistically described as literature. And again, this will all be clear on the slide where I have the two resolutions that are compared, where I can walk through the examples. As for how I think the negative should deal with the subjective nature of the agent of the federal government and the means of fiat being decided, is on one hand similar to how I think you deal with the whole idea that the resolution does not come out of objective means, but is subjective based off of the voices presence at those conversations, kind of how one is traditionally taught to even think about what it means to write a resolution or whatever. And I think that, again, to some degree, debaters are not responsible for the actor that is chosen in the resolution. Yet, there is a very healthy and active debate occurring whenever a topic is being crafted or whatnot about whether or not the federal government is the best actor. And whether or not we should maybe just say the United States and, let that be defined as whatever it is, whether or not there should even be an actor defined, whether we should go back to how resolutions used to look about, I don't remember the actual time period cut off, so I'm not going to try to get into that debate history, but where they were just resolved should this action happen, and whatever actor could possibly do that action was up for grabs. and whatnot. And I think because that debate is happening elsewhere, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made by framework debaters that that's not really something that can be resolved by a ballot in round, nor is something that, any one individual round necessarily has influence over, and therefore should not be a consideration for the negative to have to answer or respond to, because there's like no possible capacity for them to be doing it. It's not the best answer, but like it is the logic that goes behind, I think, a lot of how framework is understood to kind of describe the actions of it. And then like the secondary like level defense about why the USFG should be chosen as the actor, or at least defended as the topical actor. And it depends on the topic how exactly you want to describe this. On the CJR topic is how I wrote the examples in my notes. But like having Congress or the courts, like those are just the most prominent actors written about in the literature in the context of the phrase criminal justice reform. And so it's what best matches the mechanistic act. It's the actor that best matches that mechanistic action in terms of having the like most wealth of literature available about it. It's the actor that, and this is not as true on the CJR topic. Like if like the 50 states had been the actor, it might be more true, but it's the actor that has the capacity to affect most of the system or whatever the mechanism is described. And third is it's just like the one that has not only the most literature about it, but also the most controversy about what they should do, given how many different moving parts are kind of in play before a decision is made. So there's a lot of literature for process or whatever that kind of affects the lives of everyone in the United States. Again, no single one of these is like a good enough reason or a good reason, I think, for the USFG to be the actor or the one that we're constrained to. But like they're all good enough reasons when you mix them together to be like there is some justification for why this is true outside of just the inertia thing that exists within debate. Slash there are these debates happening elsewhere. But like at some point I think negative debaters can just like, or should like be willing to just be like, yes, there are a bunch of things in debate process wise that exist and that we use to understand and conceptualize what competition is that maybe are morally dubious and are utilized by bad actors to do bad things. But at some point, they're kind of just what we have and what we're given every year. So at some point, we should work within them. And that's kind of a position you're always going to have to defend. So I don't think you should be scared to say that. But like at some point, you're going to have to say that and defend that position. Because there's only so much justification that actually exists for why these things happen.
I agree with you there that like there seems to be this like you said fear, I say intentional gray area line that like teams that like to read framework like to do, where they try to promise this kind of radical alterity space of how they challenge, or like not us, not our institutions. We're not saying that. And so the question kind of those debates becomes, then what necessarily is this kind of more radical kind of understanding of either A, institutions proper that the affirmative will call on at a process level to defend, or B, if it's not a question of defending the necessary kind of radicalness of these institutions, what about your kind of investment in them is different or changes, or that the ability, the level of the interpretation, that debate is able to kind of move away from some of that offense if it's still tethered by an interpretation, right, that would assume that there is some good faith within, you know, using those institutional kind of processes as at least the launch board for it. So like that's kind of like the irritation from like the affirmative side, kind of reading the affirmative to negative teams who do this, because it's like, well, it's one, I think not only, I don't think it short circuits the affirmatives offense a little bit, but I think that it's unfair. Like we can have like the latter portion of like, you know, the impact stuff later on for framework, but I think it's unfair to the affirmative because as we're putting together the 2AC, it's like it matters as to whether or not the negative is going to like defend that wholesalely and like say that with their chest, or to be like, I mean, we can make it better through clash and competition, Stan. I'm like, okay, but like, what does that have to do with the interpretation? We have to respond to that first. How do we, like, you know, you get to move that around and like kind of dim some of our offense. So yeah, I agree with that kind of like like kind of that statement that teams don't want to do that. I do want to kind of ask some questions, like not questions, because not, I mean, I guess it could be a question, but maybe it's not.
I mean, this is a dialogue. You are free.
It is a dialogue, but like this statement, and I'm going to try to focus purely just like on interpretation and stuff, not like counter, like none of that business. But this idea that the U.S. FG, the government, is the actor agent that the interpretation is not focused on, and that, you know, the different forms that only kind of ask the question of should this policy be passed. I don't necessarily think that the resolution necessarily that the question that the affirmative posits by reading the critical act the way that they do, and like once again, there are so many different types of critical affirmatives. So like, I'm not necessarily defending that every AF would be set up to say this, but just kind of from the conversation, looking at framework kind of in a vacuum, is that, you know, it's sidestepping, acknowledging the USFG as an actor, right? Like the interpretation would still mean that you are saying that it's the USFG should do something proactively, like positively, that, like, you know, like insert all the kind of affect stuff of we are all affected by, you know, it as an actor, and so therefore we should debate about it. My thought is like affirmative agrees with that, right? It's like we know that we are affected by the, you know, actor of the resolution. Our interpretation or choice to not defend it in a kind of proactive, positive way is the kind of site of kind of the advocacy of the affirmative, right? Which does not negate that the negative can't defend the actor in a different way that is responsive now to the new offense or new kind of way in which the affirmative is interacting with the resolution. So I don't know, that just kind of, that is like the part to me that kind of never, not doesn't make sense, it makes sense, but why it must mean that like affirmatives not focused on agent. It's like affirmatives have focused on agent because affirmatives are affected by agent. We choose to understand it or either a pessimistic account or a different kind of way to engage the debate of USFG by putting the onus on, you know, either the negative or, I mean, I guess, no, on the negative to defend that statement in response to our defense of the actor. So it's like the actor is still at the center of the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And for clarification's sake, like maybe this is just like my wording of it, I don't think that affirmatives are absent that question of the actor of the USFG or whatever, but I think the I guess response that the interpretation is having is that the choice to not use that actor is the problem, and outside of the question of the justification for why it's good to sidestep that actor, because there's the prior question of, you know, predictability or what the process of a debate should look like. And I think that, I don't know if you want me to get into that now or like leave that for the predictability debate, but yeah, okay. Yeah, but like when I unpack that, like I think that that's what like separates it, is like framework. It's hard, right? Because like a lot of your arguments are caught up in like a lot of how debate was structured, you know, through years and years of repeating and like slight refinements. I would never recall them like reforms or whatever, but like refinements to the same system. That makes it very hard to like, I guess, present challenges to how it should work, because like you literally learn about how debate works by learning those processes that are kind of caught up in all of these assumptions and whatnot, right? So like similarly to like the difficulty of like even like imagining like a different world or like different like ideology for some people, depending on like how broad it is or whatever, imagining changes to debate or whatever are always going to be met with the question of like, but how does that meet the goals, or like what is intended by the current system? Never the question of, but does the current system actually meet those goals in the first place, which is what the AF is actually asking. And so framework debaters kind of are simultaneously forced to be like defending like, but you know, we are for these goals and you are not for these goals, but also like, hey, the system is not meeting these goals in the first place. And so I think the move to be like, we refine or make the system better through our interpretations is like an attempt to like suture those two ideas together, but like there's like no real way for that to happen on the negative side. So I think that the negative is kind of forced into the position of being like, well, we can't be responsible for all this at some point. Like, we're just trying to have like a tea debate. But like, no tea debate comes without, you know, ideological assumptions or baggage, or the baggage of how debate was created in the first place either. So it's like, and it's just like, and that's why I sympathize a lot with policy debaters. Like, when I hear the claim, at least in these debates, that's just like, you know, like, oh god, what was the exact wording I was going to use? I lost the thought of what I was going to say. But just like the sympathetic argument of just like, you know, this activity is already so hard and we've learned to do it a specific way, and we kind of just want to play this game in this specific way. We understand the importance of these interventions and critiques or whatever, but like, what power does any individual ballot or this debate have to do anything about that? Like, and like, I feel like it's almost like a form of internalized pessimism or nihilism. And I'm not saying this is true on all parts, and I'm sure there are plenty who do not believe this, but at least my understanding of how that argument plays out, it's like, yeah, I sympathize with that a little bit, even though I understand that that is probably a morally dubious position given the history of how debate has come to exist.
Word. That makes sense to me.
Now, the logic behind that makes sense. I do feel like it's a little weird on how there seems to be somewhat of a double standard on where affirmative counter interpretations are obligated to defend against every possible perversion of it by, you know, a random team, or, you know, whatever ways it could be creatively spun to be the most, you know, unlimiting, even if that's a misinterpretation of the counter interpretation, while, you know, in the same sentence, we don't have to defend, you know, all parts of debate, just our interpretation can, you know, create self-reflexive, you know, contestation. It seems to be like one side has to defend every single possible perversion, while the other side, you know, gets to say, you know, pessimistic about the ability for a system to change. It's just about this one debate. So it just seems to be, you know, annoying when teams get to have it both ways in that regard, in my mind at least.
I agree with that.
I guess my thought on that is like those criticisms are two different aspects of an interpretation, or like an interpretation of debate, right? So like, one is like, what do, like, when people are critiquing counterterps of like, but someone can interpret and read this app this way, like, I think that's more of an issue of like how limiting or like the wording one chooses in their counter interpretation, where the other is like, hey, you know, all of these people, you know, choosing the topic are messed up and don't include these voices, and therefore this wording is inherently tied to those actors' decisions to like choose those words. And it's just like, I don't know if that's necessarily true, because the interpretation that's making the topical interpretation, yes, is using the words picked by those actors who made the resolution, but is being justified through different evidence and justifications that are like individual to the interpretation being crafted by the framework debaters in that round, right? So they're responsible for the justifications and how the actors use the interpretation they have presented for the resolution in that round, but not how the resolution came to be interpreted or justified in the first place.
No,
And like,
sense.
that might be a double standard in terms of like, you know, semantics or whatever, but like, to me, I understand those things as being very different processes.
So, like, take for example, 2AC reads neg neg. AF is like, but they could spike neg neg and not actually defend it by the end of the debate, right? Likewise, then AF is like, race to the bottom is inevitable. People are going to read artificial, uniquely small AFs that aren't, you are questionably topical, but NDT judges don't care. So like competition skew is inevitable. And then the neg team is like, yeah, but that obviously doesn't meet our interpretation. That's a question of that T debate. But then, you know, the breaking of the neg model on the affirmative is a reason why neg doesn't work.
I mean, like, I think so that example is weird to me because there's not an explanation for why that smaller AF wouldn't be topical. Like, I think the negative would have to do the work to justify their interpretation in that. So they're starting that T debate. It's just like the full T debate is not happening unless the affirmative responds with it, which is what I interpret that second statement to be like, that's a T debate to be had to mean, which like obviously is not what all debaters who say that mean or like are trying to do with that statement, but at least my understanding of it goes that way.
Or
and
for
like,
example, you know, TVA that's not topical that's given in one of like the like 5 TVAs drawn, and then
I think that's an auto reason why like affirmative teams should be crushing negative teams to be like, this proves you have no limit, right? Like that's when you should punish the other team. Like that sucks. The negative debater crafted a terrible interpretation or crafted a TVA that doesn't meet theirs. Like you lose.
Which I think honestly to the high school folks and to the college folks is like my career done ended my senior year on a TVA that would not have even possibly been topical under their interpretation. But, you know, you let that one go and you just like give it to the game. But even to the high schoolers who are watching, OMG, these TVAs aren't, they're TVAs. They are, I guess, versions of an affirmative that defend an actor or some process that gives you access to some ground in theory, but like via what you're actually defending in terms of affirmatives that are in meat. No, they're absolutely not. And I think that from the affirmative side, like, yes, your disstats are nice. Yes, your counterterps are nice. Yes, you impact turning things is nice. But I think, and why this conversation is valuable is, wait a second, are even what you are saying in the kind of negative argument, is it sound? Is it like logically sound and does it fit? And a place that I would go is the TVA. Because if they have just like a nebulous list, which they always do, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 TVAs, and probably one is actually really good or 2 are really good. And the other 3 are just kind of there to prove a point. Like to be like, well, I mean, like if you're going to explode limits and like, boom, we're going to put a TVA here. That also does that. But guess what? It defends an actor. So you could have done it. And that's more punitive than I think is actually pedagogically valuable or even the point. So like y'all need to be kind of locked into that. And I would say like even ask the question before they put it in the 2NC or in the 1NR for like, what are some examples of like affirmatives that will be topical under their interpretation so that you can kind of be in that debate before they say it? Because in high school, I've seen it as the grab computer and go, yeah, the TVAs are. Do you want a list right now? Because I can go there. And it's like, hold the flex for somebody, you know, who cares about the gym. I don't need it. So, I mean, I do care about the gym. And so I guess I agree with less. Not that. And so, like, look at that, ask that, see if it makes sense. If it doesn't, that goes towards you. Their model or their interpretation justifies an explosion of limits. Why is the affirmative any worse if it's just a qualitative question now of you don't have an actor, TVA does have an actor, but even in the world of the TVA that they have stated, it explodes limits, you explode limits. What's the worst explosion? Like, they still explode, but like, at least this is an actor, so we can have like a very, very small, shimmer of like a link argument to a critique, maybe even like than Rita K. But neither here nor there. I do think that, if you have a closing thought on that, Caitlin, to get to your thing.
I was just going to say that's a great segue into it, but if you have more thoughts, continue, please.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah. I don't want to spoil any of my thoughts on the TVA because I think I have a unique thought position as a policy debater on it in terms of, okay, slight spoiler, I think it's a stupid argument. I think it's a bad argument. I don't know why everyone's obsessed with it, but we'll get into that near the end of the lecture. Yeah, that's my probably hottest take on framework. I think the rest is like pretty in line with it, but I've had many an argument with other policy people about it. But I take crafting the interp very seriously because I don't think you get to say all the things like we should not have the baggage of like how these resolutions or whatever come to interpret or like be or whatever. If you don't put in the work to craft an interpretation you care about that like shows you've like thought about what a resolution could be if it had like more critical ground of, what's kind of occurring or assumed in the resolutional process, like. And that's at least how I always approached it in terms of like understanding how to go for framework from my perspective. So I pulled 2 college resolutions that I've thought a lot about to like give examples of what I mean when picking out different parts of the interpretation to define. So there's the actor phrases and what those are that are underlined, and we already kind of talked about the role those played. So I want to talk about the other phrases that are underlined and italicized here. So for the 2017-2018 topic, the phrase that I think one should be concerned with defining and kind of using as the basis and justification for their ground and why they have, the best interpretation or limit on the topic is the phrase establish national health insurance, because it describes mechanistically what, bless you, what the United States federal government would have to implement in order for that topical action to occur. So those could range anywhere on that topic from doing a single payer funded by a value-added tax that, provided all of the benefits described under Obamacare, and AFs then differ just based off of different single payer taxation schemes or benefit schemes. And that's what's considered implementing national health insurance, or it could be like a larger debate about whether to implement single payer versus just a public government offered option instead of, replacing the entire private insurance scheme, et cetera, et cetera. And, that's the debate to be had about what it means to establish national health insurance, is what the scope of the change to the system would be. So that would define that. For the 2018-2019 topic, there's a lot more words, so it gets a lot more complicated, and I feel like people over-defined on these list topics when they just need to really only define a couple phrases. So for like a topic like this, the phrases you would be concerned with defining are the phrase increased statutory and or judicial restrictions and executive power of the President of the United States. Because again, you have the phrase that describes the bar an AF must meet mechanistically in order to be topical, increasing statutory and or judicial restrictions, whatever that means. And they have to do that action to a specific actor or object, the executive power of the President of the United States, and whatever that term individually means. And then when you put those phrases together, then you understand very clearly mechanistically what the AF would have to do, right? And then beyond that, that's why you use the USFG as the actor to define those things, because then there's literature that defines what it would look like as that actor implementing those things. But it is not necessarily what all scope of those actions could be. And that's kind of why you want to start first by describing the act and then modifying it by the actor with the kind of subjective interpretation of the resolution, rather than start subjective, then describe actions. Because then that's why you end up with messy TPAs and stuff like that.
So then, Caitlin, do you think they're obligated to define the part of the topic that's list oriented at all?
It depends on the act. So if the affirmative attempts to relate to a specific area in a list area, I think it's worth defining some words there just to give an understanding of what those actions means in the context of that specific area. But if it's just kind of like a critique of, like in the list example here, judicial restrictions, or like the idea of executive power itself or statutory restrictions itself, then like, no, I don't think it's worthwhile. And that's just team dependent. And often on list topics, you run in more of the former rather than the latter, i.e. people who are going to try to describe a particular area and action under that, rather than kind of just critique the idea of the topic in general.
No.
Word. So can I go to the next slide? Word. For those though, like you said, we want to make sure that y'all are here. Are we feeling good? Things are making sense. You're seeing some of the controversy. You're seeing the conversation kind of flowing. Show me like a show of hands even. Give me the hand up or speak now. Add some thoughts. I'm waiting for some hands.
I think we can all agree that TVAs are trash.
Okay. Well, you know, we're about to get in. Well, that's to come. But okay, thank you, Tristan, Dana, Rohith, Lisa, Najara.
So does this mean that TVAs should not be argued, or that they're just usually bad arguments?
Save for when we get specifically to the TVA. But I think that Caitlin has gestured toward the side of, yes, that they're a little meaningless, but specifics on that will come when we get to that portion. So I would save some of those thoughts and questions for that moment when we get to it, but just kind of at the level of the interpretation, kind of our discussions about it and how they work. Is all of that kind of making sense to y'all, spurring some thoughts in terms of how you think about your arguments?
I have a question about the AF interp.
Okay.
So a lot of times it's kind of hard to find an interp that like can still answer all of their reasonability stuff, but still manages to kind of garner all the education that like your AF is talking about. So like, how do you like construct the best interp that's still reasonable and like answers some of their standards?
And you're speaking side of the affirmative or the negative? I'm sorry, Rohith.
For the AF.
Okay, I can take that one because it's something that, you know, I think we were doing a lot of, which is just thinking through two parts. First is the concept of a link differential, right? So your counterinterpretation doesn't have to solve every part of their argument, and inevitably they're going to win somewhat of an argument that theirs is more limiting, more fair. There will always be some impact differential between your counterinterpretation and their interpretation. But the thing when making a counterinterpretation, going forward and responding, is politicizing that they have to not only win a differential between, you know, the two interpretations, but that the impacts they can weigh in the 2NR is not, you know, clash as an intrinsic good or fairness as an abstract value or the difference between no debate and debate, but instead about the difference between your interpretation and their interpretation, right? So one of the things about the counterinterpretation that I think a lot of people have the problem with is they assume the goal of the counterinterpretation is to soak up all offense or have a perfect model of debate, or, be just as fair or just as any other reason. No, the real reason of the counterinterpretation is to limit the scope of the negative's offense while giving you the potential to outweigh it with your external offense, right? Because no model of debate is perfect in any singular way. The negative might have the most fair model of debate in the world, but there are ethical reasons, there are, scholastic reasons why it might be. And the role of the counterinterpretation is essentially a question of impact calculus, right? It is the question of how to understand what is the scope of their offense, what is the scope of your offense, how can you create an interpretation of debate or create an interpretation of the resolution that prioritizes one over the other. And the purpose of weighing it is describing why you should privilege one over the other. So you should be thinking through counter interpretations that solve some portion of their offense, right? So Caitlin's not a fan of this, but I was always a fan of the neg model of debate, which is essentially the claim that affirmatives can either be a normatively topical affirmative, or they can make a hard pessimistic claim that says the resolution is always bad, right? The logic here is it rids out the large portion of the apps that don't make a determinate claim about the resolution, that are like, we just need to think differently, or we need to just meditate on the resolution, or we need to just, do something that's not super contextual, right? But it allows affirmatives who have, large critiques of the resolution to essentially make a very pessimistic claim that says we refuse the terminology of the resolution. Thus, the negative has some sort of ground. The negative is locked in for the potential to be like resolution good, counter plan, or any other thing, right? You have to think through what is locked in your model of debate as possible negative ground, because the majority of affirmative offense or negative offense, in the context of framework, is like, in your model of debate, what logically and predictably can the negative assume they have or could prepare to respond to your affirmative, right? Because the problem with indeterminate apps or, the wide range is like, if there's not much a team could come to before the tournament and be like, predictably, I can expect this to be of red, and I will do hours of research because I can predict it will be used, right? Creating your model of debate means creating an interpretation that has some predictable basis that someone could come to before the tournament and be like, this will be used as research, right? So when creating your interpretation, don't just think through like, what is the limiting factor? Because I think counter interpretations that focus too much on limits are kind of the ones that fail a lot of the times, because inevitably they're going to win, a proliferation of possible affirmatives. The question is, within the scope of the affirmatives that are within your topic, is there a predictable negative ground to those? And I think prioritizing that as the basis of your counter interpretation is a much more strategic route than trying to, win some defining characteristic, i.e. a term of art that will limit out apps, right? You want to group it more so on, does the apps in your interpretation have a negative potential for clash?
So with that, to those who are in the Zoom with us, and you are someone who reads a critical affirmative, I'm very interested to kind of workshop some good and bad examples of your counter interpretation. So if you are willing to read some aloud to us, and what was the resolution, or if it was like last year's, I mean, we're pretty knowledgeable about what that was, but to state what was the counter interpretation that you were working with, and then explain to us kind of why that was the case. So does anybody want to offer up a counter interpretation that they read on framework? Somebody.
I can say one.
Sure. Okay.
Najara, and then Rohith, go ahead. What was yours?
So my very first counter interpretation for debate was,
but just like in your most recent, this is the debater that I am today. This is what I read when I was a novice, and this is what I said. No.
So just read my most recent one.
Yeah, what is your most recent counter interpretation?
I believe it was the app should be in the direction of the topic.
App should be in direction of the topic. Okay, so let's start there because I think that's a counter interpretation that a lot of teams will say and have said about what that means. Caitlin, Jacob, before I kind of say something about kind of my thoughts on direction of the topic, does that meet kind of your framework for counter interpretation? Should be a question more about predictability and impact calculus?
So my immediate thought is counterinterpretation in the direction of the resolution is, sorry for the, context, but is in the direction of a good counterinterpretation, but needs slightly bit more work on what the direction of the resolution means. So I think it is a good thematic, explanation for what a counterinterpretation can be, but I think needs some slightly more defining characteristics. So when you say in the direction of the resolution, does that mean you have to make a statement that says, so let's take the criminal justice reform topic in the context, right? Does that counterinterpretation mean the affirmative must make a statement that one of the three following areas needs structural changes to it, right? i.e., policing needs a structural change, forensic science needs a structural change, sentencing needs a structural change. Is it just you need to critique one of those and say what's currently happening is bad? What is the kind of limiting or, essentially change that needs to be made, and at what intensity does that change need to be made? And I think changing the counterinterpretation from, either just direction of the resolution to describing the scope you require, because I think without changing the scope you require, it means that could be like just saying the resolution is bad and not having to make a change to it, or, making foundational changes, etc. And so I think the real thing is just like defining the scope of what direction means.
Yeah. I'd say that was like pretty much my thought on it, is like it just offers a lot for a negative team to work with and kind of paint your arguments in the worst light possible. Because if it's just a direction of anything, like that phrase means nothing and doesn't really guide debaters on kind of what they should be doing with their arguments, or like what the burden is when they are affirming, or in vice versa when they're negating. Like, what does it mean for an affirmative to sufficiently be in the direction of the topic versus what does it mean for the negatives to prove that the affirmative is not sufficiently in the direction of that topic, given whatever direction they take, et cetera, et cetera. So I think having a more precise definition helps a lot, as well as like allows you to craft much more particular and needled disads to negative interpretations that just make it harder to deal with.
Are there some words that we can think of? So like if there is counter interpretation, direction of the topic, what is an example? Like, we're workshopping, so it doesn't be like, but like closer than just in the direction of.
So for the context we used on the, college topic was the affirmative has to restrict the object of the resolution, right? That there are 5 objects of the resolution and the affirmative has to defend a restriction, which we defined as a prohibition, but can really be defined in any way. They have to defend an argument that says one of the, areas of the resolution needs to be restricted, but the affirmative gets to defend, who is the actor for that, what the restriction is, etc. But that the negative would need to be able to predict that they would get to say, like, in the context of our argument, first use is good or deference is good, right? That those have to be locked in as negative ground, i.e. the topic disad is core negative ground, but for example, the politics disad is. Maybe in the context of the criminal justice reform is like the affirmative has to defend a structural change to criminal justice in one of the areas. Really depends upon, which terminology you like in that context.
Mm-hmm. And I think,
Yeah.
sorry, Caitlin,
I just said yeah.
Oh, word. To Kiara, I think that for this upcoming resolution, that's a I think that's a good starting point for a working counter interp for you, since we're kind of waiting on the different lists. Like any kind of list resolution, in my mind, works really well with kind of like a restriction of the objects of the resolution, because it's like a choice of like picking or choosing which ones you want to focus on in the topic. But that's something I think would be kind of helpful for you to kind of start thinking of your counter interpretation in that way with that language. But that's all that I wanted to say on that one.
Also, I do have a counter interpretation from last year when the time comes.
Rohit, I think, also had one too. So let's make sure that we get everybody. Rohit, Kiara, we'll do yours next. Rohit, what was yours?
So I kind of went between two, but the one that we used the most was the affirmative must analyze power structures that arms sales and their scholarship are implicated within.
So analyze power structures that as a restriction or as removal. I think that would be like kind of one of the questions that a negative, like thinking just from kind of the negative thought is like, is a criticism a form of restriction or reform? I forgot what the full wording.
I think that one thing that, like, the argument we made to stuff out was that our criticism was in terms of like a reduction, but like you can still reduce arms, but you have to just analyze the reasons or like the implications of what that means for like scholarship and your discussions within the debate space.
I can already say, just kind of via how you're describing it to me, is that I've got a few questions for consultants when you're saying it. It sounds kind of open-ended, right? That
definitely
like
sounds bidirectional.
Yeah, it sounds bidirectional. It's a better way for me to say open-ended. But I have questions as to, one, when you say criticize kind of the structures that allow for arms sales or for the kind of transaction of arms sales, does that kind of analysis have a direction, right? So that's where Jacob is coming from when he says bidirectional. Like, is that just you have critiqued them, that is now sufficient? What is the criticism of those arms sales allow for the negative to negate, right? Like, is the baseline that you have criticized them and that criticism is good or bad or wrong? That's what the negative is kind of interacting with, that the criticism that you have offered about arms sales is incorrect. Let us introduce a counter theory on arms sales that is rather correct, and then have the debate about, whether or not a reduction of arms sales through that kind of analysis is good. Them finding one kind of evidence that supports both a reduction being good in the context of this kind of counter theory of arms sales is probably slim to none, slim to zero. And so it still runs into kind of that the predictability arguments that the negative would bring up. And so what I'm trying to offer, one, is kind of thoughts and considerations of making sure that you give some direction to kind of the criticism of the res orientation that you would go for, but to add some directional focus, right? So like critiquing it as it relates to a reduction, right? Or like critiquing it and having some jurisdiction for what the affirmative would be accountable for, that kind of criticism being. So this might even sound like a second sentence, right? So like you have the interpretation, but then you have an explanation of what exactly that locks you as the affirmative into defending, so that the negative doesn't get to say, well, I mean, that's kind of vague. It's like, well, you responded with the next portion of the interpretation as what you mean by that. But I'm just saying via what you have said by what you mean by that still sounds very kind of bidirectional, as Jacob put it. Because I don't know what necessarily that gives the negative, or even what that gives you and holds the affirmative accountable for. If that makes sense if those words were words that were what a negative kind of 2N would be thinking when looking at that counter-interp.
So my thought on those counter interpretations is actually you are making the right argument in the wrong way. I think if you want your argument to, your ability to suck up their offerings or your interpretation of the topic to be about power structures or, structural claims about how the world came to be and how the topic came to be, I think the way to navigate that counter interpretation is, instead of saying the affirmative has to, critique the power structures that make the topic, which I think the problem is really, then it opens the negative to make the claim that that counter interpretation allows affirmatives to pick any power structure or any ideology as the basis. You should instead be making a descriptive claim that the power structure you have isolated sets the bounds and meaning of the topic, right? That it's not a definitional question if we're making, an ontology claim that's like, this is what this term of art means in terms of, like the dictionary definition, but instead the power structure, your ontological claim, the structural conditions are what have inaugurated the potential or the scope of the topic, right? i.e., what is the literature surrounding the topic, i.e., what are the political events happening around the topic, what are the historical conditions that set what the topic is, what is written about the topic, what impacts are in relationship to the topic. And your argument in that context is those power structures, those ideologies should be understood as somewhat as a definitional claim, right? That if your argument's like, this is what is the topic, then you should essentially just make the claim that affirmatives have to respond to those because those are the, things that, define the topic itself, right? I think instead of being it as a counter interpretation of this is what affirmatives have to be, you should essentially be like, no. So in the context of last sales, like arms sales cannot be understood without understanding these structural conditions, and essentially use it as a way to define the topic versus as a counter interpretation.
Jacob, right? Because that sounds like two sentences to me, right? That sounds like here's a statement, and then like the additional stuff that you're saying that frames that statement, right? So like,
I don't think that's true though. I would disagree with that characterization.
Then what is the sentence?
I think the sentence is contextual to the affirmative. So the example we gave was on the on the executive power topic with the trade section.
Mm-hmm.
We had a big thing at the top of our affirmative that's like, here is the history of settler colonialism in the context of trade,
right?
That produces the, conceptual foundations, architecture, meanings of what trade powers is.
Right.
It does not be like when someone says trade powers, it means this X concept, but we've said the ontological claims we made about the world essentially, carve out where people can then put in definitions. Argument is that is a sufficient limitation upon the topic, right? So instead of being like counter interpretations, affirmative have to, do that, then defining it. I think the first part largely makes it too ambiguous. You need to make the prescriptive claim that what you said is not just one of any interpretation the affirmative can have. It is the interpretation, right? Likewise, how a negative says, this is what is the scope of the resolution based on these terminology. You need to be using the structural claims you have made to make an interpretive decision about what is the scope of the topic versus a broader claim about what affirmatives can do within a bunch of different fields.
Right. So because this is going to lead to another slide, right, where we get into like counter models. So I just want to like conflate the two and like allow for like, just like in terms of teaching that there is like a distinction. So with what you have just said, what is like the interpretive like jurisdiction or statement that ask, what is the counter interpretation? What is the counter interpretation?
Yeah, so I think, for example, the claim that Rohit made as an original counter interpretation is closer to not really an interpretation of a topic. It's a division of AF ground and division of NA ground. I'm saying this thing should actually be more about the interpretative meaning of the topic, right? So likewise, in a T2AC, instead of being like counterinterpretation, the affirmative would have to do this. You'd be like counterinterpretation, structural, criminal justice reform means this X thing. You're literally moving to define the words. I think in this context, this counterinterpretation should be less framed as this is what the affirmative has to do and more this is what the resolution means. And then from there, after you define the resolution alongside your ontological description of the world, then you say this means affirmatives must respond to this particular power structure because we made a historical, definitional, and prescriptive claim that this is what the resolution is, right? You don't want to make it a claim about speculative, about within a bunch of different things, it could be this. It is this is what that means, right? So not...
I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying to pinpoint kind of like role and label, I think, largely. So is what you are describing a counterinterpretation?
Yeah.
Okay. So then with that answer, I'm assuming that the bottom portion, because I get the larger framing part, right? Like the ontology stuff, textures, kind of the jurisdiction, or not even jurisdiction, but just kind of what the affirmative's direction towards the resolution or whatever counterinterpretation that they introduce will be, right? Because that's going to very much so affect what the affirmative's goal or reasoning for bringing up ontology in the first place was. I was just making sure that at the bottom portion, that sentence that is, and therefore the particular way in which the affirmative is critiquing the structure in this way needs to be this, right?
Yeah.
That the counterinterpretation, that is the statement label. If we were to identify what is the direction that the affirmative is taking, that is the direction that the affirmative would isolate is their thing. I just want to.
My only statement in that context is when you're making a counterinterpretation like this, it needs to be less vague than, for example, counterinterpretation restrict the object of the resolution or counterinterpretation direction of the resolution. That you essentially need to go specific claim about ontology, about the topic, and then move towards AF can do this or AF can do that as the secondary part. So I was saying you invert it instead of, broad specific then broad.
I have a quick question on that, the type of counterinterpret that you were talking about. So when we would answer standards like predictability in education, that response would be what we would say is that we are predictable because every question of the resolution is a question of anti-blackness. But for counterinterps, if the very metrics or the ends or every discussion within the resolution is implicated by our theory of power, then is that how is that the definition for the resolution?
I think you have to. I think there's really two ways to answer this, Rohit. The first statement is first that yes, that is a definitional claim that you afforded a particular theory of what the resolution is. And their disagreement is that a predictable definition, right? Not, is this a predictable affirmative, right? So then you have to have the debate about, should we prefer terms of art? Should we prefer, theories of power as descriptions of the resolution, et cetera? And I think what requires there is a slightly different answer to what predictability is. Because your question is whether or not when we hear the resolution, should we either examine what are the, hidden systems of power or, unconscious assumptions that, carve out the scope of what the resolution can be or could be based on what people have written about it, or what is literally written. And your argument would be that the claim that this is unpredictable is based on a myopic understanding of what the literature base is, right? Your argument is this is how the literature case came to be. Their argument's this is what the literature base is, right? And so your argument should be that it is predictable if you have navigated this research base and have come to the conclusions, right?
Okay, and that's how we like then get access to all of like this is why our model debate is good because where it's kind of a forced confrontation.
Right. And then the second thing is kind of what you can do in terms of the second way is kind of a tricky thing you can do with how framework debaters describe their argument. So one of the things that will happen in most framework debates is the kind of discussion of, does the ballot resolve really anything? Mm-hmm. Right? Framework debaters will, the kind of phrase a lot of framework debaters like is, it's not a question about this particular debate. It's a question about models of debate, right? And that it's really comparing different models of debate. And the way it becomes kind of described a lot of times is essentially framework teams fiat every person in debate would operate under their model of debate, and then kind of compare the, efficacy of that model compared to a world in where that does happen. I don't think they make the claim that they literally fiat it, but that their answer to, so after, you vote on framework, people still read chaos. Why does that mean why you vote negative on framework? Like it's a meaningless vote, right? And they're like, that's not really, an important question because it's a question of whether or not our interpretation and our model of debate is good, right? You should say then that likewise should also be true of the affirmative, that we get to have an interpretation of what the topic should be, can be, and is, and then essentially, export that out to other debates and say a year long of debate in this way would be better than a year-long debate in the other way.
Okay, that makes sense.
And with that, I believe Jasmine wanted us to move on to the how to answer slide. Is that correct?
Wait.
We still have Kiara.
Oh, right, we said Kiara. Sorry, my bad. Yes.
I forgot. That's my bad.
I mean, if necessary, we can move on. It doesn't really matter to me.
Not necessary at all.
Okay, for sure. So for context, this was on our Hidden Figures app of the space topic last year. So yeah, counter-interpretation, Black women create themselves through bodily performance. In the instance of this affirmative, Terry recalls, reenacts, and dreams of a world by which Black women are accredited for their contribution to space and to this space. Excluding our model of debate directly means excluding Black women. They write themselves through bodily performance. Therefore, the affirmative recognizes debate as a site for activism.
I would say my first assumption, like at least from the negative side, like if I were a framework or as a framework debater responding to this, my first question I would ask is why the mechanism of the AF or refusal to defend a topical plan text is mutually exclusive with the ability for Black women to speak themselves into the context of space policy. So I think you would need a phrase that describes the difference between, like, for example, using evidence or, articles from Black women that like define like a particular action that could be taken under the space topic versus like the actual reading of the top of your Hidden Figure stuff had like quotes and stuff, right?
It was.
I don't know if quotes are the right wording for that.
It was the one I see was 9 minutes of poetry.
Yeah, so poetry, like the actual spoken word, lived experience, whatever. So something that differentiates that from just like, well, Black women once supported this policy and wrote about it, therefore we have spoken their existence into the debate. So like a mechanistic definition.
Got you. We also read the Hammad. We also read a piece of Hammad evidence right after the counterinterpretation. So like, yeah.
Yeah, I would have just pulled language directly from that and then used that paragraph as the justification for why the AF is a necessary intervention.
For sure.
My only thought would be a slight description of how a judge would come to the conclusion of if the AF is a bodily performance or not, or just like some ability to, judge if an AF is topical or if an AF is not topical under your interpretation, or the non-need of that, right? So if your argument is like, there are two ways to essentially come to understand the topic, which one is abstract, legalistic, and one based on, bodily performance, right? than just some kind of, is there anything not included in bodily performance, right? Or is it an ever expanding category? And I'm guessing your card defines it somewhat. But I think just like some essentially line where the judge can be like, okay, there is something that is not this. And I don't think that requires much more of what you have, just being like description of bodily performance or some like limiting factor.
For sure.
But I think it's set up to, you know, have a clear delineation between what the differences between the model is and what the impact to that model is. I think just like the line of like what is and isn't the model, then I think finishes it up to be a clear and understandable counter-interpretation.
Is that agree, move on? Okay. Cool. So did you have any more follow-ups to like Kiara, like question-wise or whatever? Okay, cool. So then the next thing is from the negative perspective, thinking about how to answer a counter-interpretation. And I think a lot of this obviously comes down to thinking about what counter-interpretations, like what do they lack in terms of, are they limiting enough or are they precise enough, and what does it delineate what the app talks about? So like literally how descriptive are they at describing what the role for the app is and the role for the negative is, and the implications for both in defending those. How descriptive that is, I think, is you know, kind of dependent on how picky you want to be. And I would caution about being like, you have to describe every little detail about it, because your own interpretation will not meet that standard. So whatever standard you hold the counter interpretation to, your interpretation also has to be. So, you know, keep that in mind when comparing the two, because otherwise I think affirmative teams, y'all should be pointing out the slippages when the negative is holding you and your counter interpretation to a higher standard than what their interpretation is. And that's why I think care should be put into both. Obviously, I think it is put into it more on the app side typically than the neg side, but I think both sides should be actively thinking about what does it mean for your interpretation to be implemented in a round. And I want to take a little side note here before I continue on the slide to talk about the phrase Jacob talked about, which is like, it's not about any individual round, it's about a model of debate, and just like kind of talk about the logic that comes behind, just to like describe like how these debates are being imagined. So the reason that like that phrase is so popular is like in any tier framework debate, when you're comparing like particular interpretations and like what it would mean for people to like use that interpretation in any given round to, you know, decide an app, it's not really about the particularities about like, well, you know, Bob over here will interpret it this way, but like Jessica will interpret it this way, and therefore those two things aren't consistent, therefore you don't have a good interpretation, right? Because your interpretation could encompass both of those ideas of it, but may you know, not include you know, Sarah's idea of it or whatever, and that's what matters. And so like the reason we talk about the models is because you talk about like over time repetition. If this were put through the test, you know, people read topicality arguments against these arguments, these apps that are read under this interpretation, kind of what would it break out to be over time if it were adopted as the model. And the reason we kind of like skip that whole process conversation is because, you know, when your mind is auto going to deciding between what is a better interpretation for debate and the model that independently produces, you're auto going through that process. Okay, like let's assume everyone was on board anyway. So it's just to, you know, match up the descriptions of your interpretations with your impacts, rather than like, you know, auto assuming that like you're fiating actually out of people's mindsets or whatever. And that's important because at least for the negative, your goal in this debate, when you are answering the counter interpretation, you are setting up your impact calculus. You're setting up what about you are saying the judge should care about. Because ultimately, your impacts, like in the grand scope of like what's actually like in the world, who cares about fairness? Like, who cares about the game of debate, right? Like, obviously we all do because we're here learning about it and participating about it. But like, if debate like lit up in fire tomorrow, like as an activity, like, you know, and people still got paid, whatever. Like, I don't mean like people lost their jobs or whatever, because that's like a different impact. But like, if debate as like an ideology activity just like ceased to exist as it currently does, but like we all still kind of existed in this community, like we might be a little sad, but like, what's the actual impact of that, right? And that's kind of, you need to be humble about that and realize that when comparing like, you know, against impacts of like, you know, when we don't talk about, you know, like the anti-Black or the, you know, settler notions underneath a resolution or whatever, and that reproduces those logics and actions in real life, like, you know, you're kind of coming in with like a water gun into like a knife fight, right, so to speak, in terms of like competition or comparing, right? Like those are like very real things that people have to like go through and, you know, have very real consequences. So like, I don't know. So the way to kind of get around that is, on one hand, well, you have to set up what a judge can actually solve. So your interpretation, because you're focusing on like what happens if a judge theoretically were to uphold that standard you have as a topical standard and vote that way, you're talking about the power the ballot has to enforce a rule. So you have to discuss the limited scope of what a ballot can actually solve. And in comparison to that, how much of that does it solve your opponent's impact versus yours? Your impact, it will probably solve a lot of, because fairness limits or whatever are just kind of arbitrary temporary things that don't really have tangible impact outside of debate existing and being, and as an activity being assumed as a good and like everyone should get access to it, versus the last very real impacts, which may or may not actually be solved by the ballot, because again, like, it's just deciding within a game or not. Then the second thing you have to do is to make the judge care about your very frivolous concern versus like actual concerns, right? And the way to do that is being like, the way in which you compare interpretations, the way in which you determine which one is better, and then therefore the model subsequently after that, is purely through the decision of what is the most predictable and limited. And that's based off of making them care about predictable limit or literature bases by like recognizing and almost using the idea that you're stuck within all these structures in debate that kind of like have come to be and repeat themselves into existence, by being like, look, like all these things exist inevitably and kind of structure how we are in this space, no matter how much we try to refuse it. Like, there's always going to be the ballot, there's always going to be the competition, there's always going to be the want to win tournaments, et cetera, et cetera. There's always going to be, you know, or as far as we know, there's always going to be a resolution that says the AF team should do X, Y, Z, defend X actor, whatever. So given all of those constraints, you know, we're kind of just left with like, all right, how do we ensure everyone can kind of participate by those in the best way possible? And the resolution is one compromise, and it's not the ultimate compromise or like only way to do it. And, you know, we kind of have the resolution we have, and therefore, you know, you should care about our interpretation of it because it's predictable, whatever. And that's kind of what guides how people interact with the round. And that's kind of the logic you literally have to walk through in order for any of this to make sense and to like get judges to care about predictable literature bases. But that kind of sets up that, like, you know, everything else, while it is important, it is something that we can consider, is not really within the scope of the judge to like jurisdictionally do anything about, and therefore they should not burden themselves with caring about. And just like recognize you're actively making that choice to diminish the concerns or whatever, so you kind of have to answer the critiques and impact turns to those things.
Yeah. Well, we're good with the interpretation. This was just the interpretation level of the debate, which, like, I think proves how, I think framework is a simple argument, but I think that it's also a convoluted argument the more that you discuss and think about it. and think about ways to nuance it on either side. And so I'm hoping that, as you can see, this being an hour and a half on just solely the interpretation level. But this is one of the most, I think personally, one of the more important parts. I mean, clearly the interpretation, like you gotta win that to really kind of have your stuff. But it's an important portion of this that we discuss and think about a lot. So if you're with us, thank goodness. Whoa. If you're feeling like, you know, things are clear, starting to make a little bit more sense, I'm hoping that's the case. I'll be honest, like, you know, not, these things aren't new thoughts, but like just even the counter interpretation workshopping and kind of thinking about that was even helpful for myself. Like I said, I'm taking notes and kind of thinking about how I'm coaching this year on this topic, as well as just like in college, how I'm coaching on topics. And so it's always so helpful to kind of go back and forth, not only with Caitlin and Jacob, but like with y'all, to see how y'all are kind of synthesizing this. Like, is this making sense? Like, I'm saying these words, we're saying these words, but like, is it coming across? If not, then we got to change what we're doing. So always let us know if like words are coming out that don't make sense, so that we can make them make sense. As I like to say, to be helpful to you all. So without further ado, if there are no other questions, we're going to move on to a new concept, and that is counter models. This is going to be interesting. Yeah. So before we get into kind of the distinction portions of everything, of these things, kind of want to lay out some implications. First is that we should understand the resolution traditionally, the resolution and the framework call or interpretation as an interpretive model, i.e. the resolution has said a thing and the interpretation is a hot take on that statement, is a hot take on how the negative wants, you know, the action or what the debate should be centered around to be, what that should look like, how the debate should be centered, how it can develop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that is all based upon a particular take on how this debate should go, what the value statements are in the ground, and you know, the scholarship that is being kind of offered on both sides to have a kind of consensual or kind of clash-based analysis can happen. The implication that a counter model does produce to this is that it's indeed an interpretive model. And that those aren't neutral or objective, and that understanding interpretations as resolutionally solid and universally accessible is antithetical to its definition. It is one of many, i.e. interpretations are exactly just a take. It is not like the wholesale way in which one can read the resolution and understand it. That is taught and reinforced. The second thing is that this affects the consensual agreement of a stasis, or how to engage in the resolution, right? So kind of this notion of a common place or something, or a site of agreement assumes, right, that interpretation is 100% accessible, or one, that it is objective, neutral, and something that both sides can come to, but two, that both sides kind of in the way in which they are taught and trained to kind of understand that interpretation, synthesize that interpretation, the goals, you know, that they want to have in the debate around this interpretation are all the same. And generally, right, via the advent of the critical affirmative, that is not the case. And so this will affect the ways in which that consensual agreement is assumed and that it should not be assumed. The next part is that there is a difference between the state and defending the state as a heuristic. All of us have seen the Zanotti 14 card, or a Zanotti, you know, derivative of, and, you know, even outside of that, kind of arguments about whether or not it's a role-playing argument, simulation argument, or just a defense of the idea that, you know, a impact should be resolved and what is the best way to resolve that impact. And so understanding the distinction between the state and defending it as a heuristic is going to be very important for how you set up, your offense as an affirmative to framework, because a smart negative is going to make arguments about why they do not necessarily have to defend the state as an ethical actor, but rather that it is a good instrument to kind of center the clash to create or effectuate change or to challenge institutions. And so it as a heuristic is like just a thinking model, a way in which you kind of understand problems and come to solutions to those problems is through understanding the state as a heuristic, as what the negative would defend, and making sure that your offense as the affirmative is not too focused on like they said state bad, game over. You're not going to fare too well if that's the strategy of the affirmative, especially if the negative is smart and highlights that distinction, right? That like we can also agree that the state is bad, but it's a question rather of how, within that institution, within the status quo of us living underneath the state or within kind of the state apparatus, how are we kind of complicating those conversations, creating resistance and dissonance and things of the sort? And why is that something that is mutually exclusive with the interpretation presented by the negative? And so making sure that we're not too heavy on state bad, game over, you role play, simulation's not good, like love it if the negative is not too talented, but if the negative is a little talented, okay. Sorry, I get distracted. Jacob's art is impeccable. But to not get too overdone with this idea of state bad, got it, role play bad, got it, they are the state, all my offense is going to be on state bad. It's not going to be too good for you. And that the conflation of the two, i.e. that form and content in the context. And so I guess in terms of using language that Caitlin was using earlier, content over process is the context of hypothetical enactment, is a move of humanism. Now don't be too kind of distracted by kind of the word insert humanism. This could be an insert, whatever kind of literature base that you are interested in. I use humanism because I'm talking about kind of the ways in which mores and norms get to be authenticated at the level of subjecthood and kind of how we assume what is a practice that is accessible, what is a type of debate that kind of is incentivized based upon people who are able to, engage in the resolution in a particular way. It's kind of the building of a model for individuals who are accessible to that model. Very kind of reductionary of kind of why a move of humanism. And we'll do a bit more on that when we get to kind of the model in particular, but I'm just raising some implications to why a counter model might be useful for you, depending on what your affirmative is. And lastly, the importance of the distinction between interpretations in debate and models of debate is going to be very, very key. And a debate that I had when I was in college, one of my last, and one actually that I had versus Caitlin at the NDT, was like where kind of the slippage of grammar and language can really kind of be your downfall, and like the ways in which you kind of need to be specific and kind of create these distinctions early on to help concretize these ideas and implications that you're trying to arise the framework. And so hopefully the goal of this is going to be to help you understand the distinction between the counter model and a counter interpretation. I'm hoping that that's kind of like an overview idea, kind of framing for bringing us into the counter model. Jacob, are there anything you want to add to that, or does that kind of cover things for the?
No, that roughly kind of
okay.
Or covers.
Heard. So now the interpretation versus the model. You've heard the interpretation. Now we're going to get into the model claims for how these things operate and their goodness. So I did some kind of verse things for you in terms of creating a header for interpretation and model to kind of give you kind of visual of how they're distinct. So for the interpretation, we got it, right? It's a hot take of the resolution and is imbued with an authority through presumed objectivity and agreement, i.e. that this is the debate space that we're in. This is what, the people who created the resolution or, the resolution statement were thinking. This is the scholarship that is accessible, that can be generative in this debate. Assumed kind of or presumed objectivity and agreement, and maybe a word that I forgot to add, a relational capacity between students and the resolution that is the same for everyone, and is what's going to happen in these debates via the clash debate, which we'll get to. The other part is that when debates at the interpretation level are happening, there is some agreement, right? Like, you are not necessarily disagreeing with the negative, that there needs to be kind of a referendum on a restriction or a reduction or a reform. You are getting creative at the level of how the affirmative does do that, but in a different way. But that you are still in somewhat, in a direction of the topic. And so the counter interpretation does not break you out of that. Some of what Jacob had brought up kind of complicates that, right? And so when you're doing kind of the larger kind of, or the larger framing for the specific reason for why you're using ontology and its interactions with framework, and how that kind of sets the thresholds and metrics for what does the affirmative need to be in order to be in the direction of the topic with that understanding. But I think that it's still the specificity of it being within kind of the resolution and how your framing arguments interact with that, which kind of create the distinction between a counter model and a counter interpretation. But that the counter interpretation's ability to access negative ground because in the direction of the original interpretation, but has additional net benefits that turn the negative. So like very traditional structure, like counter interpretation, net benefits, your interpretation is net preferable for these reasons. Model stuff. Is there something you want to add to just the interpretation that I just said there, Jacob?
No, the interpretation, I will say, I think there are sometimes a less of a bright line between counter interpretation and counter model when in some people's interpretations, because I think, for example, like a neg model or a, counter interpretation discussion about the topic is also in somewhat a counter model claim, because it's not a definitional claim about what the resolution is, but it's more so, a model for what the responsibilities are of the affirmative, even if they're not topical. So I think the line can be sometimes blurred.
I think the line can be sometimes blurred. I agree with you, which is why I think that when people are thinking about the interpretation and like a counter model, that you create that line. Like, for example, that example that you give about the negative model, I would just call that a counter model debate, like, honestly. And that's kind of how we did it in college, which is like, we're going for this as a counter model argument. We'll put a counter interpretation, whatever. But really, we're not going for that. We're going for this. But I understand kind of like the way in which it can be perceived and used effectively in the counter interpretation stuff. What I'm just hoping that y'all who are kind of like listening and watching is understanding the larger aims and goals of your affirmative, because that's going to be kind of the referee on a lot of this, because some affirmatives fit more with kind of a counter interpretation strategy than with a counter model strategy. And like, we'll get into kind of how to signal when your affirmative is that or not. Because sometimes I think that a lot of affirmatives claim a lot more than what their literature is doing, how they're framing the affirmative, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, but I agree with you, Jacob. But counter model is that this is not an attempt to create a relationship to the negatives interpretation, but rather is a relationship to the debate writ large. So what is debate's relationship to kind of the processing of what happens when we are discussing the resolution, right? So like all of the things that debate can generate, the conversations that can be had, the predictability, the class, like all that stuff is kind of what the counter model is kind of pointing to. Is there a possibility of those conversations being good in the first place, right? So like those conversations are tethered to a presumed objectivity or a presumed telos presented by negative that is assumed to be productive, but is it productive? Is that the way that we should be understanding the ways in which these conversations are happening? And so the counter model kind of asks that question. Is like, is that true? Is that the way that we should interact with the assumed hope of what debate can do? But what debate can do is tethered first by the interpretation or statement that the negative or affirmative does draw up for, you know, how we interact with that question. It is also a criticism of like I said, that objectivity and agreement that structurally changes the goalposts of the debate. The onus is on the negative to prove why its interpretation is best outside of norms, because solely winning that policy enactment is key to fairness, deliberation, education, et cetera, isn't a defense of why placing value on that interpretation is good. And I kind of want to slow that down for folks. And if you have questions for, you know, what I mean by that, please do ask. But kind of the thought process, kind of where that sentence comes from on the slide, is that you have said, like, when I say you, I am speaking to like the negative, that you have said that the affirmative has to defend some type of hypothetical enactment that would defend, like I say, in the context of this resolution, and substantial reform in one of the following areas. Like, that is what you have said. More importantly, you are focused in on, did I just get a message? Should I just ignore that? I should ignore that. Okay. Sorry, I get distracted. But like, you have inserted the interpretation for how we should understand the kind of ways in which we can get into conversation about the benefits and, you know, the disadvantages to engaging in the topic in this way on a content level. My question will always be to the affirmative. It's, why are those things good, right? Like, why is that true? And generally the deferral, and I think we kind of hear the deferral from Caitlin, and like, rightfully so, right? Earlier on, is that we don't get to choose kind of, you know, the way in which the topic is chosen. We just have access to what is presumed a fair and predictable literature base to engage in these discussions. Yes, maybe these institutions may be problematic writ large, but we should not be held accountable for the ways in which those institutions do that, because we are kind of just debating it as like, you know, the content is made present, and we're able to kind of transform that via these debates as our own independent individuals. But to me, that doesn't still answer the question, right, of why is specifically the enactment of that via the actor or through an understanding of reform as institutional engagement necessarily good. You have outlined why the kind of mores of debate are good, but you have not established why the enactment itself is key to these things, or why those things are universally or even accessible, et cetera, et cetera. And so the slippage between those things make it difficult for the affirmative to buy into that, right? Clearly we're not going to, because we're affirmative and we can't. But like, the negative does not at that point have a model to explain the value of debating enactment on an institutional level outside of, well, this is just how the game is played. This is just the rules. We don't get to pick and choose them. We just like have them. Let's make them better. Question is, but what if those games are already just messed up? Like, what if the game is just like never going to be accessible to a point of having different scholarship and different orientations and ways in which we can understand solvency and kind of the ability to make debate, whatever it is that we're trying to make debate? Like, what if those things aren't true, right? And what if we have the ability to have discussions that start from that presumption that are productive? What if that's the case? Then the response that's just like, well, we're just kind of here. This is just where we're going to start. Gets complicated. Does that make sense to everybody? Like, how that becomes complicated? Just like that question. I want to hear words from people. It just like, does that make sense? Are you there? Are you not there?
I had a quick question.
Uh-huh.
So you kind of made when we're making the distinction between like interps and models, you talked about how y'all just went for counter model because the interp fundamentally required a different relationship to debate. Mm-hmm. So like how would you articulate, would the counter model still like be articulated in a similar way to the counter interp, or like how'd y'all say that?
Say that last part of your question again.
So like when you're saying this is our model of debate, like is when you say counter interp, you like there's a way you say the interp and like what we went through just now. But like when you're saying counter model, how'd y'all articulate what that would look like?
I mean, yeah, sure. So like the example of a counter model statement would be that debate is a site of meeting, like well, we were taking from like Hartman and Spillers when we say that. That if debate is a site of meaning making, we cannot understand things as like objective or sans interpretation, i.e. the fact that debate in and of itself. So one, we had to kind of interpret debate as like an interpretive model, right? That we don't understand interpretations to be things that are like universally accessible, objective, neutral, or that get them to what the negative tries to institute as key to all of these different mores and norms in the processing of debate, i.e. the predictability, the clash, the kind of things that you get out of being able to have a debate. We would argue that those things are not necessarily tied to the interpretation, but that there's some way that the negative is trying to create that kind of connection or relationship that is flawed, and that is not, accessible, that is not good, that is not, something that necessarily means the affirmative should not have its criticism, its entry point into the way in which it has chosen to have a discussion over the topic, right? And so understanding the resolution as a site of poesis or a site of meaning making means that we, one, understand that kind of starting point. Interpretations are interpretive. But if that is true, it means that the negative has chosen to have a particular kind of value statement about the resolution and how it should function and how that should look and how that should work. That's fine. Defend that. And that the affirmative has a counter kind of understanding of the ways in which we would orient ourselves to the resolution. The only difference, right, is that like what does the negative not get? And I guess I'm kind of going above where we are in the PowerPoint to say this, but that the only argument in this world the negative would not get its framework, right, is that you first have to defend why using institutional kind of enactment or policy making is uniquely good and valuable outside of the standards, outside of saying it's good because that's the way the game is played. It's good because like that is what is fair. We want to know why it is good and how it competes against what the affirmative is saying. The affirmative would be on the opposite side of that kind of antagonism, right? So like we are not defending kind of first beginning with kind of institutional engagement, or like I don't want to say institutional engagement because even then I have concerns about that being the assumption of critical affirmatives, because I think that engagement is a very bidirectional thing, like in terms of what does it mean to engage? Does it mean that you're critiquing? Does it mean that you're affected by? Because if that's the case, then like the affirmative is also that. But more or less that the affirmative is held to the commitment of not defending that as a starting point, of not defending that as how we orient what is solvency or what are the metrics, because metrics are affected by solvency, or the advocacy statement that you choose. Like we are held to that. Let's have a debate, right? Does that make sense, Rohit, to answer kind of the top level of your question of what did that look like? How did we do that in a round?
Yeah, definitely. Because like y'all were talking about how some debates, there isn't really a distinction between the model or the interp. And I was just confused why there needs to be if the counter interp requires a fundamentally different model. So that was it.
Jacob, I think like a brain and like it'll clear processing and wanting to say things that go forth into the world.
Or no, I wasn't really thinking about anything.
Okay, it just looked like you're like,
No.
Taylor, are you there?
Yes, my camera just like crashed a while ago and won't turn back on.
Okay. I just want to make sure, are you present?
Yeah, I sent a note in the Zoom chat, but I don't know if you saw it. But I've just been chill listening. Because there's a slide in a couple after this where I have my thoughts on the game model and stuff.
Heard you. Because that is the answer with the negative, I think, says, asserts, but doesn't actually go into. But I think that'll be when Caitlin speaks on it. So the counter model, this is going to be helpful for when you're deciding, is this something that I can say? Because it'll be really awkward if your affirmative is not, is not structured to do these things. So I guess the first is that the counter model poses the question, and really I've said a lot of these things. I just have it here so that you can write it down and have it kind of textually in front of you. Kind of a lot of thoughts are happening, but here are kind of them written out, established. Here you go. But that it poses the question of why are we here? And how are we choosing to engage this space? And how do we define value and where can that be tested? Right. And I think that there needs to be this understanding of what are the weaknesses of your affirmative and why are they intentional? What does it mean that you can have and what you don't have? In general, that's helpful when answering framework if you're not even considering a counter model debate, but just in general, knowing what the limitations of what your affirmative can and cannot defend is going to be helpful to you, especially when asked in cross-sects about kind of what the role of certain arguments are, or what the role of the negative would be, or the role of the affirmative under your situation. Is having a more nuanced understanding of your affirmative and what it can and cannot do is going to be very helpful to you. But I digress. That's the first level of kind of testing for, not testing, but understanding of the questions that a counter model poses. Next is, what is debate a site for? Right? Make sure that your AF is designed to answer that question. This is kind of the signaling claim for whether or not you can read this argument for your affirmative. Are you making a kind of modeling claim that is going to affect the kind of metrics of evaluation writ large, right? Like, is your affirmative making kind of arguments that impede the traditional ways in which fairness, education, kind of the ways in which mores and, ways in which we choose to engage this space operate and look like? I'll give you a TLDR of what your affirmative looks like. That's not the case. If you are reading kind of like a criticism, there was like that big militarism AF on the high school topic that was just like humans are weapons or like something of the sort, right? And that it was more of like a historical read of the ways in which weapons are, are not the physical apparatus, but like the human apparatus. And like, we first need to expose the ways in which humans are, programs towards violence and how we enact that into certain communities, blah, 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 blah. I don't think that's an affirmative that has a counter model. One, because I think that you are still operating within the same mores of like debate. You're not really challenging or changing kind of the way in which you relate to a space or how you are calling upon sites of evaluation. You are making a prior question before the engagement question. You have not answered whether or not the reduction of arms sales is good or bad. It sounds honestly, Rohit, like your counter interpretation argument, right? About a direction, or not direction, that wasn't you, but the argument about making an analysis of the structure before getting into those things. I don't think that the counter model argument makes a lot of sense in your case, right? You're not calling upon changes in the way in which we ground ourselves in evaluation, but are just making a kind of prior statement before we can get to what the negative is talking about. And that puts you in a dangerous place. And also, Jacob has discussed in terms of the counterpretation, how to ground that. But I think that's a very clear flag for when your affirmative is not centered that way. Also, it is not a call. It is not the call and response of the counter interpretation, because it is not bothered in the direction of the negative interpretation and resolving or turning its standards. Now, necessarily, because it is going to implicate standards, but it's not going to implicate standards all the ways and in the exact same ways. If you were to read a counter interpretation, there is like if there's a Venn diagram, there is some like similar base, but there are some like distinctions. Lastly, is that a useful grammar for this concept is poesis. I've described this above, but the process by which meaning is made if the presence of instrumental action is meaningful, because that is just how the game is played. Have we derived meaning from the instrumental action? Or has it denied the possibility of any other value systems, i.e., does it allow us to say that instrumental action is bad? Has the statement even met the burden of saying that instrumental action is good? Is something that I would also kind of pose to, the negative, is that if it is just good because of the game, why is it good? The last thing before Caitlin adds in her a contribution on the kind of game theory, something that I have found is that negative teams like to have both. And like, while that I guess is fair because constructive speeches and like you get to change and, augment your offense to be the winning side, I think that the negative always likes to play both. They like to be like, no, the engaging institutional or engaging defending instrumental action is good because of all these plethora of reasons, right? Because the state can do this and the state can do that because it allows for kind of a focus on for movements or to see when movements demands are being made or not made and to kind of add more insight and grammar to that, like all that stuff, right? But then there's like the second prong to it that's like, but it's also good because that's just the way in which like the game is played, which enables us to have clash. My issue with that is like, which one comes first? Is it good because that's just the way that the game is played? Or is it good because of kind of the possibility of that action being something that is possible for change and possible for criticism? Why not just defend that and not defend all the additional stuff of the mores, the customs, the, how the debate should and should not look like? Why must it go to that place and not just a defense of that, especially if, and and Caitlin will bring this up, the question of how does the negative know that before the debate starts in terms of how the affirmative is going to kind of answer this question or orient itself. There's some answers to that too, but we'll get to that. I'm sure Jacob has thoughts on this too. But like the negative makes that pivot a lot. And so it's like, yes, two can be true at the same time, but two are true at the same time for a very intentional reason to kind of stifle the offense from the affirmative on one end, i.e. like to take all the, state bad, state da-da-da, we can't do anything within the state, da-da-da. It's like, yes, we can. We know why. And the intersection of state can do good things, or not even that, changes can be made within the state is the justification for the internal link of clash for what would debate look like in a kind of round in which the affirmative were to have read a topical advocacy and the negative would have challenged that question. The assumption is that round, if change is possible and good conversations about how we can be tactful are a thing, that kind of in that world of debate, we can be the radicals. We can change the ways in which we understand state logic is the kind of defense to, why both are necessary. But it's like also not true and only based off of a maneuver of kind of responding to the affirmative offense after the fact, not how you read framework in the first place. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Jacob, if you have anything to add to that portion, please add now before Caitlin does her.
I will say the one thing that I think is kind of important on the negative when kind of describing or answering counter models that I was kind of having a conversation with Caitlin about, like competition, ground. That one thing that you can push a lot of the times on these is even if you can sketch out a model where that negotiation happens, where there is ground on both sides. Caitlin brought up a point. The problem is a lot of times judges don't know how to evaluate that, or that when judges are given those models, they allow teams to break the rules of those models, skew the frames, and that it prevents, that the problem with that is there's ambiguity in it, and that, a normal interpretation of the topic via hypothetical enactment prevents the judge intervention in that regard. And I think that is one way you can push back against counter models, is more than just like what affirmatives can do, but which model of debate also prevents judge intervention in the, least intrusive ways.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's like at a point, for example, like you have the argument where you're like, our model of debate allows them to, read counter plans on the negative that are competitive, right? It still requires the judge to make some decision on the level of the permutation or views of competition. And at that point, with the judge who's not experienced in the model or et cetera, can, do whatever they want with it.
No, yeah, but what I will say before Caitlin speaks is that like counter models aren't selfish, and I think that not selfish in a bad way. This is all kind of like, there is always a kind of selfish portion to all these arguments because you want to win, but you still need to understand the counter model as some type of criticism of the negatives model. So it's not just like you have exposed the contradiction, you are also critiquing the contradiction, which makes the counter model an active thing that can be voted on, if that makes sense. So it's like, yes, it is true that the judge has to kind of figure out ways for evaluating what does solvency look like, what, necessitates an affirmative ballot. But I would kind of gesture that it is the role of the affirmative to kind of set up some guidelines for that. If you are inserting a counter model, that's at least clear enough, because there's not really going to be, at least how you defined it, questions on kind of what those kind of changing metrics for evaluation can look like, provide some defense to the argument from the negative that you've not provided that, or that it can be kind of infinitely arbitrary, and kind of forces them to be more specific to kind of the ways in which you have changed the ways of how debate is evaluated under your counter model. But I think the thing that should not be forgotten is that if you were like reading a critique, right, against the policy affirmative, that not necessarily is it on the onus of the alternative to solve. It is just on the onus of the alternative to refuse the metrics that the affirmative is using, because of like they're bad, right? And so kind of copy and paste that to the bottom level of the counter model. I think that you can do a very similar thing and be like, yes, counter model solves, but also counter model is critiquing. That critique in and of itself is something that is net productive, that you can vote, you can vote on alone, because it's not an attempt to show like a better version of, like, its role is not to solely show a better model of debate, but to expose and kind of punish the negative for, participating in such a flawed and parasitic model, right? Without like an alternative, yeah, we make debate better in there, like, ooh, kumbaya. Counter model is not about kumbaya and like, let's find a way in which we can make the world a better place together. Let's make things accessible to all of us. It's just a exposure of the fact that we are all operating underneath models and getting the negative to not assume that they are not when they are. Jacob, are you good?
Yeah, I was agreeing.
Okay. Caitlin. Oh, what? Nope. Wrong thing. Okay. Wrong thing. Okay.
There should be one that's just like, yeah, that one.
Did we? Okay, well, y'all, oops. Skip that to go to that. So backtrack. It actually works better this way, though. Game
I
model.
agree.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like Jasmine lastly said, it's like the negative has a model. Like, I don't know why everyone forgets that, like, the justifications we like come to for like why debate works in the way it does, and like the way in which we guide how people act in this round just like kind of are just like nebulous and not identifiable, because they like really are. And like framework debaters say this all the time. It's a game. But like for some reason we don't teach it as if it's like a model that we are actively upholding. So I kind of like want to just like break down what it is and kind of how a negative debater should think about kind of justifying why debate operates according to this model. And what I mean by that is not just like why it should operate to that model, why it achieves the ends that the activity debate should want, but like literally that the activity was built around the model itself. And that's why it's so hard to change it. And that's kind of how the negative should present it in round. How true that is what the debate is about, though, for what it's worth. So framework is a debate about debate, like I said earlier, but it's about two very specific aspects of it. The process of what a round should look like and what determines the parameters for better debating, i.e., it's why one does what they do in an individual debate and for what ends they do it for. That is what you are describing to the parameters for driving. So the answers to those questions help set the frame and context for which approaches are the most effective for achieving the ends that debate wants, which is, not homogenous and not singular. There's infinite number of reasons anyone joins the activity debate and does it. But the one thing we can kind of, identify that everyone kind of is there for is to win. Because otherwise, everyone would just kind of give up rounds as soon as things got difficult. There would be no incentive to argue outside of the winning, right? That doesn't have to... Now, what that win means is different from other people, whether it's just a victory or whether it's like something broader, and that's like a different question. But like that's kind of one way I think you could think about how to get out of the question of like, each person's a unique individual and has a different reasoning for doing debate. It's like, yeah, but it ultimately boils down to like in the round, why we're going through the process we are going. It's to win that individual round with hopes of continuing in the tournament to continue doing the activity. And winning just happens to be a vehicle for that. So where should a negative debater start thinking? I think they should start with the phrase and the presumption that debate is a competitive research game. And I think why is that it's the closest at describing what you want to defend as your model without having to take too many logical leaps from many gut assumptions that I feel class judges share about the activity that we're in. And I think that the reason that that's kind of like a shared, or those are shared gut assumptions, even if they differ in severity or whatever, just comes from like how we're taught to conceptualize the activity, which, the AF is problematizing in the first place. But like, that's what makes it harder for the AF to win its model versus you to win their model, is they have to critique the assumptions people already have about how the activity works, where you are just re-justifying them, if that makes sense. So working through that phrase left to right about why I think it's the best phrase. So starting with the word competitive is, I think it's very hard to contest the idea that debate is competitive. There's ballots, there's a judge or multiple judges, there's RFDs, speaker awards, elimination rounds, bids, etc. And all of those are unique incentives for wanting to win a debate beyond, other things outside of that. Like, you get to further your chance at like, putting your ideas out there into the world. You have the potential to like get clout or whatever, or, can make your parents proud, or like whatever, like, personal justification you have outside of like, all of the incentives offered by the structure of debate. Now, obviously, not every debater may prioritize winning as the abstract reason or like definitive driver as why they would quote unquote do debate, but it is the reason why people don't just give up after the block to AC or like at any point of the debate and are just like, cool, you're right, we concede to any other team. And it's like the reason like we go through like these like long days of like getting up and like all of us are like, we hate this activity and we're doing it, right? Like there has to be some justification for all of it. Which means that, and you know, if that drive does not exist, if the other team's like, no, we actually don't care about winning, then like what then reason do they have for wanting or getting the ballot, right? And like that's kind of the, I think, line everyone finds themselves up across in a debate is like at some point you're going to have to say you want the ballot, otherwise there's no reason it shouldn't go to the other team. And like, so, you know, that's something you're always going to have to defend. So it's competitive in that sense. The second portion of that is research. It's a competitive research game. So research, I think it's also hard to argue that debate isn't research-based, given that almost every argument in this activity is supported of by research of some sort. I think what is contested is what constitutes research and what constitutes appropriate literature or ground or whatever. But I think that's a different question and different debate to be had over what is research or what does it mean to present a well-researched idea or idea for a topic, rather than it's a research ground. And that's like the whole ground debate that we're going to talk about later. And so your job as the negative is to make all right, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So then the last part is debate being a game. And I think that's the hardest part to prove out of that phrase and is actually what the whole like model framework debate like gets to the heart of. And kind of how one should conceptualize the purpose of this space. And I think your job as the negative is to make the judge think that debate is not only a game, but also is a game that has rules and norms that should be followed to maximize the benefits of that game. Which that benefit could be said to be the competitive nature of the game, as weird and like abstract as that sounds. And the way you could conceptualize that, sorry, I have this worded wrong. Your job as the negative is to make the judge think debate is not only a game, but has rules and norms that should be followed to maximize the benefits of that game. The game is competitive and has benefits based off of. In order how you determine to maximize those benefits, whatever it is, your education, your ballots, your speaker awards, whatever, there's two different kind of mechanisms for evaluating that, or metrics for evaluating that. One is does it influence or maximize or increase the competitive nature, i.e., how does it affect the balance, or if you're a gamer, the meta of each side? How OP the negative is versus how OP the AF is. You know, everyone's gone through topics, whether you're a critique or policy debater, where you've been like, just the AF has too much to say or the negative has too much to say. How do we ensure fair, unbiased judging? So things like mutually preferred judging. What does it mean for the judge to come to a decision? What does it mean for them to interpret your grammar, et cetera, et cetera? The second metric is the content of your research, i.e., what type of education are we getting? What things are we researching it? How are we taught to research it? And what lens are we researching it through? And obviously, how you define those things and what scope you give to them gives more or less access for the affirmative to kind of be like, you create worse versions of that, or to impact turn or internal link turn what you're talking about. But I think explains why you need to be very careful about how you pick your justifications for why the game should work the way it works, to make sure that they're matching your impacts as well as like not giving too much for the affirmative to say. So how do we go about proving that debate is a game and that its rules and norms should be followed by teams enforced by the judge? So I'll start with the game component and then slowly work into the rules and norms. So they're infinite. So the process of a debate occurring should be the question of what the process of a debate round should be and how it's occurring is the question of every framework debate, which I said earlier. Given that you don't want to defend any assumptions or questions about why one comes to the debate space outside of what they're actively doing in those processes. You want to kind of create that active severance between them, which again, remember, is an intentional act the app is going to problematize, but is something you have to do in order to kind of justify the logic behind your arguments. So, and the reason for that is you don't want to make too many speculations on a variety of people's motivations for doing this activity or participating in the game. Because it opens up, I think, too much doubt about whether your concern about limits, fairness, predictability, whatever, is a reasonable concern. So given that every single debater has a motivation to win, and we know that each individual round sets up an opportunity to win, and that is compiled to create a record and a seeding that determines whether or not you make it to elimination rounds and how difficult that run may or may not be, and whether you'll continue to have the opportunity to win. Given all that, and the point of every tournament, and at the point of every tournament, your goal of a debater is to win and participate in those things, you can understand then debate is a game because you're working through a process in order to achieve a goal in that sense. That's a ham-fisted way of defining a game, which is why I also added the nuance of there has to be norms and rules to be followed, because I think that distinguishes a game from like any other like organization or motivating factor outside of just winning. Because yeah, and that's more like a philosophical question about what a game is that I really don't want to get into, but like for what it's worth, that's how I'm defining it, is all those things. So now we've set up the motivations as a framework debater for why one does the things they do in a round. So now what guides those things, and how can we maximize the ability for everyone to operate competitively without kind of, I forget the exact wording I used for it in my notes, but like basically without unfair ability to change the conditions or to change win conditions in your favor. Oh, it's actually deep in my norms and rules notes. So I'll get into breaking down what I mean by that. So norms and rules. So if we have a motivation for activities, we have all these guidelines. And, you know, they're pretty consistent despite what one may feel about all of them or what constitutes a win versus a loss. All those things. But what I think all of us can come to the conclusion is like, regardless of whether those things that exist are good or bad, it's a better system than just like random chance at deciding who wins a round. Like at least there's some logic behind it that people can predict, prepare for, and use in a round to deploy their arguments. And so these guidelines, it's hard to kind of sift through which ones should be kept, which ones should be getting rid of, which ones came out of, dubious understandings of how one should communicate, etc., etc. And it's also what makes it complicated is not just like definitive hard rules versus norms, but there's also a lot of soft rules that like really aren't enforced. So they operate like norms, even if they're like codified in handbooks as rules. So it makes it like kind of difficult to determine what actually is required to have a debate. And that's where I think a lot of the slippages in the framework defending it as a game model happens. But yeah. But norms in debate are both commonly followed and also highly contested and not followed for a variety of reasons. But usually, when one of those norms or soft rules is contested or not followed, it's because it's the subject of controversy that the AF has decided to center their offense around, or that there's like an active conversation in debate around that then can be utilized or drawn upon by AFs for their arguments. And these norms in debate tend to consist of the following things, and I wrote these in no particular order, nor is this a comprehensive list, but like just as a list of things you could start brainstorming about that you'd have to defend. Things like what constitutes topical action and whether asks have to be topical at all. Speech times, speech order, whether there can only be one speaker per speech, who can answer cross-ex questions and when those answerings can happen and whether you have to ask them when you're forced to ask, etc., etc. Whether one should read cards, citation formats, whether those are acceptable or should be changed, only reading cards during pre-designated speech time, meaning like your constructive or rebuttal times, not cross-examination times, even though those are now considered speech, etc. So now, not all of those norms that I've listed, so obviously that's not a comprehensive list, that's just a list of norms to give you an idea of kind of the scope of things that are contested. Now, not all of them are not created with the same weight in how they alter the procedures of a debate round, but all of them do have influence over the win conditions on both sides. Usually, when altered to benefit one side at the cost of another. And that's how you kind of want to frame your conversation around any and all objections to debate being a game, because if you can win all the stuff we talked about in the interpretation stuff, that their solution that they provide to the criticisms of these norms or whatever, this model, are not effective, then then you can show that their criticism you also want to show additionally, if it doesn't solve, you want to show additionally that their criticism also alters norms such that win conditions fall in their favor, so they have a better chance of winning versus you. And given that that their solution will be shrouded in doubt and will not necessarily solve their criticism, if you've established that, then you can make the argument that that criticism is always already shrouded in a cloud of bad faith, because the only justification it has for existing is the pre-debate rigging of procedures in your opponent's favor that you have no recourse for outside of a ballot-on framework. Again, you are actively making a lot of logical jumps and assumptions about how an affirmative goes about deciding their criticism and its utility in a debate round. So be aware of that. But these are logical assumptions and jumps that often don't get critiqued within a debate. So, but just keep that in mind, that you are making them for when if those critiques do occur, you have to answer them. And so then your interpretation then sets up for, or rather, this setup for the game and the game model only works if you have an interpretation that equally divides ground or provides predictable literature bases. So you could be like, see, this way of understanding the process or whatever provides equal opportunity to win within the process of the debate itself. Even if there are other like structural barriers to that equal access, which is like a different question and different portion of this conversation in general. And then that means you've now established debate is a game. Its norms and rules, regardless of kind of their moral or like effective nature, kind of just still exist and are kind of what determine win conditions. And therefore, we should be concerned with ensuring that they're not being pre-rigged in a way that people cannot access within the process of the rounds. Otherwise, there's no recourse for them outside of framework. And then you've kind of set up such a constrained view of how debate operates that I think it makes it very hard for the affirmatives to wiggle a lot of offense out of there. It makes judges have a hard time breaking out of the logic puzzle you've kind of set up. But again, be aware, these are all active choices you're making that just happen to prey upon how people logically think about debate, not that this is actually how debate works. And that's all I had to say on that. Yeah.
Word. So before, unless Jacob, you have, I mean, I guess it would be helpful to just like make sure that like when y'all are thinking down the lens of just like your net benefits, if you're not going for like the counter model, you're just going for the counter interpretation, that you're doing your, traditional LOL at traditional, but traditional kind of args of just like the other norms of debate that are bad, like why norm focus is not a good focus. Like that's all of Caitlin's kind of explanation of like, well, you don't break speech times or you don't break, when the designated time for when the 1A and 2A are supposed to go, you still operate with like all these kind of things. I think that one, you need to make a distinction between what you're talking about and what you're criticizing in terms of kind of, well, I guess first is that I'm thinking two things at once. One is that for the counter interpretation stuff, you need to explain why that doesn't matter or why like that's not necessarily like the litmus for why kind of the traditional structure of debate or the assumed ways that one must defend the resolution is bad is inherently tied to, well, you read speech, like you like to read an 8-minute 1AC is the same. So like you're at least indebted to the same system. Like how you can understand that is like, let's say you have said that there are police in a classroom, but the negative says that you still went to school, right? Or like you went to a charter school with like police outside instead of inside the classroom. It's like, yes, we got it. Like we're in the classroom and like by going there, like we have committed ourselves to some kind of space where, the police can be, or some kind of predetermined how the educational process operates. But what happens in the classroom, what happens in the conversations that you are having, you being in the school in the first place, very much so kind of changes the kind of foundation of, what's happening there. And it might be net preferable, might be net better. I just kind of, those kind of statements of you have given a speech, you have followed the rules. It's not necessarily kind of the point of what you're talking about, and probably doesn't negate a large portion of what you're still saying is that, yeah, we are doing that, but like we are also making a larger statement about kind of the institution of debate. For the model stuff, which is why I kind of got mixed up and just earlier, and kind of what I was saying is that like the distinction that you hopefully are making, right, is that you are critiquing evaluation. You are critiquing kind of an orientation question, not just like the norms of debate as they pertain to like the practices. And so like, yes, you have given a 10-minute speech, but like and what you have said in that speech matters a lot more than the fact that you gave a speech in like a particular time set. And like what you are saying in that speech is critiquing a kind of way in which the judge should be evaluating the round, how it is something that is distinct from the negative, just to kind of create some pushback and solve some of the conflation stuff for, we have norms, they have norms, which norms are good, which norms are bad. It's like we're not talking exclusively at the level of just like practices. We're speaking at the level of like what the 1NC has brought into the room, not just like what the 1NC's kind of defense as like a framework defends, et cetera, et cetera. Jacob, did you have any thoughts there before? No? Are you muted? You're muted.
I just said that was self-explanatory.
Word, heard you. But yeah, like those are just generally arguments that you should have in general, like when responding. Access, fairness, da da da. Did that. Okay. Wait, so how are y'all feeling? I've not heard voices from y'all in a second. So where are y'all? How are you feeling? What's going on in the brains, the membrane?
I'm sleepy.
Okay, sleepy. Is there a way that we can help the sleepiness, or is that just kind of like, you know, the way that it is? You didn't get enough sleep last night.
I don't know. It's just a lot of information at one time. And like we've been sitting here for like 2 hours and 30 minutes now.
So, question to that. What is the solution for your sleepiness?
I don't know. I don't really have a solution. I probably just need to go take a walk or something. I've just been sitting in one place for a long time.
Do y'all share that same sentiment, or do you want to push on? Or should we kind of create a segment where we come back to this after like a break or something? Like come back to it in like pieces and bits. Because I do agree it's been a bit. It's been a minute. It's just like very nuanced. We just want to have conversation with y'all about this. So let me know what are your thoughts? How are we thinking? How are we feeling?
I think the lectures.
That's Dana. Sorry, that was Dana. I'm just clarifying. Right, Dana, was that you?
Yeah, that was me.
Okay. Okay. Then Tristan, what were you saying?
I was going to say, like, I definitely agree that we should probably just take a bit of a small break, because like the lecture itself was really good, although because it's so dense, I did like zone out at one point.
That's fair. That's fair. Rohit, I'm assuming you agree, or Kiara, what are your thoughts?
I kind of agree with Tristan on this front.
Okay. Rohit?
Yeah, I'm good with whatever.
A break's probably a good idea.
Okay, so here's what I think we're gonna do. Because I agree, it's very dense, and I want y'all to be active in the brain and whatnot. I'm thinking that we pause on where the lecture is right now, because there's quite a. I think I'm trying to see what slide number we're on. Let's find out. Let's see. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Can y'all see my screen? 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yep.
Yeah, we can see it.
8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, there's a good amount of slides left, is what my math breaks down to. So I think that what we're going to do is we're going to call it a day on this stuff, and just kind of do some other things after a break with you all, or just like do some more research and then come back either tomorrow or Sunday after the demo debate to kind of, for y'all to see a lot of these kind of concepts and theories getting applied. So I think that'll be the most helpful. So we can just kind of plug back in with y'all via what you're working on. Because I do not want to inculcate y'all with just like everything. And I think honestly, as y'all refer back to your notes, you'll have more thoughts and maybe even more questions about how you're thinking about taking some arguments this year for yourself. And it'll be very helpful in answering those questions for you and how to like think about, arguments and strategy. So I'm a fan also of Let's Pause. I'm going to remember that we paused at 16. And so I think Jacob, Caitlin, we'll kind of talk after the Zoom is over about the strategies for the rest of the day. If it's just like research, and just talking to them, checking in, maybe even do like a open up redos. But yeah, I want to thank you all for sticking in for the first segment of the framework roundtable. And then I'm looking forward to the next part and kind of more conversation about how all these things operate and how they work. A reminder that tomorrow is going to be the pro demo debate. And so the pro demo debate is going to be featuring not yours truly, but two of yours trulies. Jacob and Caitlin will be debating tomorrow. Caitlin, Jacob and Darius, the person who gave the Afro-pessimism lecture to you all earlier in the week, will be on the affirmative. And they will be reading a counter-surveillance affirmative dealing with some literature in the Afro-pessimism canon. And so they're looking forward to that. And that'll be their affirmative. And then Caitlin and Ollie's, how do you pronounce their last name? How do we do that?
I believe it's Safiedin. I have no idea though.
Ollie S. from Dartmouth is going to be debating on the negative, the big FWK framework, making the game work, putting in that late bore. And so that's going to happen tomorrow at 4. I think that what we'll do is that we'll either kind of set up some time to give another portion of the framework lecture beforehand, or just like, no, because yeah, maybe that, or just do some drills with y'all to do what y'all have been doing on framework with the notes that you have, and then on Sunday just kind of jumping back in and doing more research. We'll see kind of what kind of holistically comes together with that, but look forward to tomorrow. It's coming. We're gonna pop some popcorn, get your flows, get ready, because I'm gonna be moderating it. That's going to be interesting. And Darius and Jacob are going to be interesting. Caitlin and Ollie are going to be interesting. And I think we're gonna have conversations with them as they're, prepping. You're going to be able to kind of hear the thought processes that take place while they are talking about strategy. So instead of it being like, oh, they're over there whispering about what it is that they're going to be doing, we'll use the breakout rooms. And so how that's going to work is that the team that is prepping will stay in the larger room, and the team that is not prepping, or the team that is not the one that's going next, will go into a breakout room so they can't quote unquote hear, unless y'all don't care, in which case we can just stay in the same room. People can hear y'all prep. But I can also, competition is real too for them. So probably we will use and employ the breakout room method. But y'all can hear what the affirmative is thinking real time. And at the end of that debate, there will be a Q&A where you can ask questions for why they chose to do what they did, why they didn't do something that you thought maybe they could have done, and just like arguments of the sorts. And they will answer those questions, and we will have had a good old tee-hee-hee time discussing and seeing a debate on framework. So are there any questions for me before we close this out?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, I have 2 questions. So the first one is, after the demo debate, are we going to write ballots or something like that? Or is it just going to be a Q&A?
I think that you should always be writing a ballot as like a practice. I think that you should always kind of have or try to develop a sense of who is winning and who is losing. So I will say have a ballot, most definitely have one.
Okay, and my second question, I have memes of the demo debate. Am I allowed to send them in the Discord?
Yep.
If you what? I'm sorry?
So me and Delia and Liam have made memes about the demo debate. Am I allowed to send those in the Discord?
This one in particular?
Yes.
You're allowed to send them in the Discord, post them on Facebook, send them out on Twitter, whatever you want to do.
I'm just confused where you had the time to create memes for this debate.
Around 2:00 in the morning.
So instead of sleeping, you said make a meme.
I mean, we were all on a group Zoom call watching Scary Movie 2, so it was either that or watch Scary Movie 2.
You were already doing that. But it's fine. Yes, if you want to share that in the Discord, go ahead, share the memes. Jacob will enjoy them. I will be confused, and Caitlin will probably, react. And so via the emojis. So go ahead, that's fine. Any other questions?
Oh, what's the plan after this, for today?
The plan will be research redos,
Okay.
and research redos. And if you want to give us a model 2A, or depending on who y'all are in terms of your 2A or the 1R, if you want to give us model AFV framework speeches, I think that would be good. But I also want to make sure that we're providing sufficient amount of time for research so that we can have these arguments in somewhat, enough complete shape for debates next week. So I'm keeping that all in mind. Any other questions? No. That's it? That's all you got for me? Okay. Well, I will see you all either via the Discord because you want to reach out to me and talk about research, or I won't, and I will see you all tomorrow. Check in. Yeah, that's all I really got with you until tomorrow. Tell your friends about tomorrow if they want to watch/register to watch the debate. It'll be fun. Darius is a hoot. Jacob and Darius together are a hoot. So, yeah.
It's gonna be fire.
It's gonna be